In the autumn of 1944, the political and military map of Eastern Europe was undergoing rapid transformation. Romania, once a committed ally of the Axis powers, had shifted allegiance following the coup of August 23rd, when King Michael and political leaders ordered the arrest of Marshal Ion Antonescu and declared an end to cooperation with Germany. This sudden reversal altered the balance of power across the Balkans and the Carpathian Basin. For the Soviet Union, Romania's defection provided an opening to push deeper into Central Europe through the passes of the Carpathians. For Germany and Hungary, the event created a new and urgent front line that threatened the very core of their defenses in Transylvania and the Hungarian plain beyond. The town of Târgu Secuiesc, located in eastern Transylvania, became one of the focal points of this struggle. Strategically positioned in the Carpathian foothills, it sat astride key approaches that connected Moldavia to the inner Hungarian territories. Whoever held this area could influence not only local supply routes, but also the larger operational outcome of the campaign in Transylvania. By September 1944, German and Hungarian forces of Army Group South had entrenched themselves along a defensive arc, designed to protect northern Transylvania and delay Soviet and Romanian advances. Their positions were reinforced with field fortifications, artillery emplacements, and minefields prepared in anticipation of an assault. The defenders viewed these lines not merely as tactical obstacles, but as the final shield guarding the approaches to Hungary's interior. For Romania, the battles that followed carried both military and political weight. Having rejoined the Allies, the Romanian army was eager to prove its value in combat against its former partners. Several divisions, reorganized after the shift in allegiance, were committed alongside Soviet units of the 2nd and 4th Ukrainian fronts. Their objective was to break through into eastern Transylvania, expel German and Hungarian forces, and secure the borders of the Romanian state. The effort was supported by growing popular sentiment within Romania, where the shift of allegiance was framed as a step toward national liberation and the restoration of territorial integrity, particularly in regions disputed with Hungary. On the Hungarian side, the stakes were no less existential. The loss of northern Transylvania had long been a contested issue between Budapest and Bucharest, ever since the Vienna Award of 1940 granted much of the territory to Hungary under German and Italian arbitration. As Soviet and Romanian armies pressed westward, Hungarian leadership feared both the collapse of their military position and the reversal of these territorial gains. The Hungarian Second Army, supported by German elements from the Eighth Army, attempted to hold fortified lines across the eastern Carpathians. Units drawn from both nations were deployed in difficult mountain terrain, seeking to block every pass that might lead to the Transylvanian plain. The German High Command recognized the vulnerability of its position. The Wehrmacht's attention remained fixed on multiple crises across Europe: the collapse of Army Group Center in Belarus, the Allied advance in France, and the tightening encirclement of the Reich itself. In this context, the Transylvanian front was both crucial and under-resourced. German forces, including elements of the 8th and 6th Armies, were stretched thin, relying heavily on Hungarian manpower. Their doctrine emphasized delaying actions and attrition, with the hope of stabilizing a line further west along the Carpathians and the Tisa River. Soviet military planning reflected a broader strategic vision. The Red Army aimed not only to liberate Romania, but to extend operations into Hungary, thereby accelerating the encirclement of Germany from the southeast. The Stavka ordered a series of coordinated offensives that pushed through Moldavia, across the Carpathians, and into Transylvania. Soviet commanders understood that their supply lines over mountain terrain were vulnerable, and the integration of Romanian forces into their order of battle created logistical and organizational challenges. Yet the promise of gaining forward airfields, road networks, and access to Central Europe outweighed these concerns. Civilian populations across eastern Transylvania faced profound uncertainty. In Hungarian-administered regions, communities braced for the arrival of Soviet and Romanian forces, fearing reprisals and forced requisitioning. Ethnic Romanians in the region, meanwhile, anticipated the reassertion of Romanian control, though many remained wary of the consequences of being caught between two advancing armies. Villages near Târgu Secuiesc saw an influx of refugees from surrounding areas, as families sought to avoid bombardment or forced labor demands from retreating Axis units. Food shortages, disrupted transport, and the looming winter compounded the sense of vulnerability. By late September 1944, the stage was set for a confrontation that would draw in multiple armies and determine the fate of eastern Transylvania. Each side viewed the coming battles through the lens of national survival and territorial legitimacy. The clash at Târgu Secuiesc would thus emerge not as an isolated engagement, but as part of the larger struggle to reshape the political and military order of Central and Eastern Europe. The soldiers who would fight in its hills and valleys carried with them the weight of these competing ambitions, as the war entered yet another brutal and decisive phase. The first days of October 1944 marked the transition from political upheaval to military confrontation in eastern Transylvania. The Soviet 2nd and 4th Ukrainian fronts, commanded respectively by Marshal Rodion Malinovsky and General Ivan Petrov, began the systematic advance toward the fortified lines held by German and Hungarian forces. Their immediate operational objective was to penetrate the defensive belts surrounding Târgu Secuiesc, opening a gateway to the heart of the Transylvanian basin. Supporting this offensive were Romanian units reorganized after the August coup, including the 1st and 4th Armies, now integrated under Soviet operational control. Their combined manpower in the sector amounted to more than 2,000 troops, supported by hundreds of artillery pieces and armored formations. Among them, Soviet T-34 tanks and Romanian R-35 and TACAM conversions. Opposing them were German elements of the 8th Army and Hungarian formations of the 2nd Army, numbering approximately 15,000 troops in the wider Transylvanian sector. These forces occupied carefully prepared positions, strengthened by natural features of the Carpathian foothills. Defensive lines were constructed with trenches, bunkers, and overlapping fields of fire. Engineers laid extensive minefields across likely approach routes, while artillery was emplaced on elevated ground to cover advancing columns. Among the defenders were German infantry divisions, remnants of panzer units regrouped after losses in Ukraine, and Hungarian divisions including the 9th Infantry and 25th Infantry, supported by mountain troops accustomed to local terrain. The command structures on both sides reflected the complexity of coalition warfare. The Soviets maintained direct control over operational planning, but relied heavily on Romanian troops to man sectors of the line and to secure captured ground. Romanian commanders, such as General Gheorghe Avramescu, were tasked with demonstrating reliability under Soviet oversight, while simultaneously navigating the morale of soldiers who only weeks earlier had fought alongside German units. On the Axis side, German officers frequently expressed doubts about the effectiveness of their Hungarian allies, while Hungarian leaders remained concerned that their divisions were being used to absorb the brunt of Soviet assaults. These tensions shaped the cohesion and performance of the defending armies. The opening engagements began with heavy artillery bombardments designed to weaken Axis defensive belts. Soviet and Romanian gunners targeted known strongpoints, bridges, and communication nodes. The intensity of the shelling disrupted local supply depots and inflicted casualties, but German and Hungarian troops adapted by dispersing positions and withdrawing into secondary lines. Reconnaissance reports indicated that, while the initial bombardment caused damage, the Axis defense remained largely intact, setting the stage for infantry assaults. Civilian populations in the immediate area experienced the full impact of this transition to open combat. Villages near Târgu Secuiesc were evacuated under orders from local authorities, though many inhabitants remained in hiding to protect homes and livestock. Others were compelled to provide logistical support, carrying ammunition or constructing fieldworks under military supervision. Rumors circulated about Soviet reprisals and requisitions, while Axis propaganda emphasized the threat of occupation to sustain civilian cooperation. For local ethnic Hungarians, the possibility of losing northern Transylvania again raised fears of displacement, while ethnic Romanians saw in the advancing armies a chance for political realignment in their favor. Weather conditions added another layer of complexity. Early autumn rains turned unpaved roads into mud, slowing mechanized columns and complicating supply deliveries. Soviet motorized units struggled to bring forward fuel and ammunition, while horse-drawn wagons remained essential for both sides. The terrain around Târgu Secuiesc, with its wooded hills and narrow valleys, limited maneuverability and favored defenders familiar with the landscape. These conditions ensured that the battles to come would be grueling, characterized by slow advances and attritional tactics rather than rapid breakthroughs. By mid-October, both sides recognized that the confrontation around Târgu Secuiesc would not be resolved quickly. The Soviets and Romanians prepared for sustained assaults, committing reserves and consolidating forward positions, while the German and Hungarian commands coordinated counterattacks to delay the advance. The clash had shifted from maneuver to attrition, with every kilometer of ground contested. As the lines hardened, the struggle for control of eastern Transylvania entered a decisive phase, setting the conditions for the intense fighting that would dominate the following weeks. The strategic goals of the belligerents in the Transylvanian campaign became increasingly defined as October 1944 progressed. For the Soviet Stavka, the advance into Transylvania was part of a wider strategic design, the drive toward Budapest and eventually into the heart of Central Europe. Târgu Secuiesc, although a relatively small town, was of operational importance because it lay at the junction of several routes that cut through the mountains into the Hungarian plain. Soviet planners considered it essential to break the Axis defensive arc here in order to enable mechanized formations to deploy in more favorable terrain beyond the foothills. The capture of this sector was also meant to ensure secure flanks for subsequent operations northward into Cluj and westward toward the Tisa River. Romania's goals were closely aligned with, yet distinct from, those of the Soviet Union. Politically, the Romanian government sought to demonstrate loyalty to the Allied cause by actively participating in combat operations against its former partners. Militarily, Romanian commanders hoped to regain full control of Transylvanian territory lost in 1940, while securing recognition of Romania's new status among the Allies. The Romanian First Army, under General Nicolae Machici, and the Fourth Army, under General Gheorghe Avramescu, deployed substantial infantry and artillery resources to the front. Their troops, often under-equipped compared to Soviet units, were tasked with holding captured ground and engaging Axis strongpoints in cooperation with Soviet divisions. On the Axis side, the strategic calculus was shaped by both military and political imperatives. For Germany, Transylvania was a critical buffer zone. Its loss would open the gateway to Hungary, threatening the Reich's last reliable oil supplies in the Nagy Kanizsa fields and exposing southern Germany itself to attack. The German High Command instructed General Otto Wöhler, commander of Army Group South Ukraine, to hold Transylvania as long as possible, buying time for reserves to be reorganized in Hungary. The Wehrmacht relied heavily on defensive tactics, creating successive lines of resistance, maximizing use of artillery, and conducting local counterattacks to disrupt Soviet momentum. For Hungary, the struggle carried even deeper symbolic and territorial stakes. The Vienna Award of 1940, arbitrated under Axis influence, had returned northern Transylvania to Hungarian administration, a development celebrated in Budapest as a historic rectification. By 1944, the prospect of losing this region again was politically unacceptable to the Hungarian leadership, particularly to Regent Miklós Horthy and his government. As Soviet and Romanian troops pressed closer, Hungarian divisions were ordered to defend every sector, even at the cost of heavy casualties. The Hungarian Second Army, reinforced by newly mobilized reserve units, was tasked with maintaining control of vital passes and towns, including the approaches to Târgu Secuiesc. The logistical dimensions of the campaign added another layer of complexity. For the Soviets and Romanians, the Carpathian terrain created severe difficulties in maintaining supply lines. Roads were few and often damaged by retreating Axis engineers. Bridges were demolished, requiring the rapid construction of pontoon crossings. Fuel shortages hampered the mobility of mechanized units, and the Red Army relied heavily on railway engineers to restore damaged tracks behind the advancing front. Meanwhile, Romanian divisions often lacked modern motor transport, relying instead on horse-drawn carts, which slowed the movement of artillery and ammunition. Axis logistics were equally strained. German and Hungarian forces operated on extended lines, dependent on railheads in central Hungary. Allied air superiority compounded these difficulties, as bombing raids disrupted railway nodes and fuel depots. German staff officers noted in reports that replacement units arrived under strength and that ammunition consumption outpaced deliveries. Hungarian formations in particular struggled with inadequate artillery support as stocks of shells dwindled with each week of fighting. Yet, despite these shortages, both German and Hungarian commanders emphasized the importance of holding fortified positions, even if it meant rationing supplies and limiting offensive activity. Propaganda on both sides framed the campaign in terms of national survival and historic justice. Soviet communications emphasized liberation and the onward march into Central Europe. Romanian broadcasts highlighted the return of Transylvania as a just outcome of their shift in allegiance. Axis propaganda, in contrast, depicted the struggle as a defense of Hungarian soil against encroaching enemies, warning of reprisals and forced annexations. These narratives influenced the morale of soldiers and civilians alike, shaping their willingness to endure the hardships of prolonged fighting. Intelligence assessments played a decisive role in shaping operations. Soviet reconnaissance, conducted by forward patrols and air observation, identified Axis strong points but often underestimated the resilience of German and Hungarian defenses in mountainous terrain. Romanian intelligence contributed local knowledge of routes and settlements, though it faced challenges integrating into Soviet command structures. On the Axis side, German signals intelligence provided warnings of Soviet troop concentrations, but the scale of the Red Army advance left commanders with limited options. Hungarian officers familiar with the terrain provided valuable input, emphasizing choke points where effective defense might be mounted. By the third week of October 1944, the planning and strategic calculations of both coalitions converged on the realization that the battles near Târgu Secuiesc would be prolonged and costly. The Soviets and Romanians prepared for sustained offensives supported by massed artillery, while German and Hungarian defenders dug in for a tenacious resistance. The struggle was no longer only about tactical gains, but about the broader trajectory of the war in Central Europe. The decisions made in headquarters and the supplies flowing, or failing to flow, through the mountains would directly determine the scale and intensity of the engagements about to unfold. The fighting around Târgu Secuiesc entered an active phase by the final week of October 1944. After days of artillery preparation and probing reconnaissance, Soviet and Romanian forces began coordinated assaults against Axis defensive positions. The opening clashes revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of each coalition. Soviet infantry divisions, supported by T-34 tanks and self-propelled artillery, advanced along the main roads leading into the town, while Romanian units conducted flanking maneuvers through forested hills. The Axis defenders, German grenadier regiments and Hungarian infantry battalions, met these attacks with entrenched firepower, using heavy machine guns, mortars, and pre-sighted artillery to inflict high casualties on advancing troops. The early engagements demonstrated that the Axis fortifications, though manned by outnumbered forces, were still capable of delaying the offensive. One of the first significant confrontations occurred near the villages to the east of Târgu Secuiesc, where Romanian infantry of the 20th Division attempted to seize a ridge that commanded the valley approaches. The assault, carried out under heavy rain and poor visibility, stalled after repeated counterattacks by Hungarian mountain troops supported by German artillery. Both sides sustained considerable losses in manpower. Romanian units reported difficulties coordinating with Soviet artillery, as poor communications led to several barrages falling short, or arriving too late to support infantry advances. Nevertheless, Romanian persistence kept pressure on the defenders, preventing them from redeploying forces elsewhere along the line. Soviet units concentrated on breaking through the central defensive belt. The 27th Guards Rifle Division, advancing with tank support, attacked fortified positions directly south of the town. German defenders, including elements of the 8th Army's 76th Infantry Division, resisted with prepared bunkers and anti-tank guns. The close terrain limited tank maneuver, forcing Soviet crews to advance along narrow roads, where they became targets for concealed 75mm and 88mm guns. Several vehicles were knocked out in the opening hours of the assault. Despite these losses, Soviet infantry gradually advanced through trench networks, often engaging in hand-to-hand combat before securing positions. Each captured bunker came at significant cost, as German units counterattacked repeatedly to reclaim lost ground. Civilians in the surrounding region found themselves trapped between the opposing armies. Many villages were subjected to artillery fire, with buildings destroyed and farmland churned into mud. Families hid in cellars or fled into the forests, carrying only essential belongings. Axis military authorities ordered evacuations of settlements close to the front lines, while Soviet and Romanian troops requisitioned food and livestock to sustain their operations. For the population of Transylvania, the battles represented not only a struggle over territory, but a daily fight for survival amid shifting control and widespread destruction. The morale of the combatants varied widely. Soviet soldiers, buoyed by successive victories in Ukraine earlier that year, pressed forward with determination but faced fatigue from continuous operations. Romanian troops fought under complex psychological conditions, having only recently switched sides. Some soldiers still carried memories of fighting alongside Germans, creating tension when confronting their former allies. Yet for many, the prospect of regaining Transylvania provided motivation, even in the face of high casualties. On the Axis side, German units displayed professional discipline, but the knowledge of dwindling reserves and air inferiority weighed heavily. Hungarian troops, defending what their government considered national soil, fought with tenacity, though reports indicated uneven training and shortages of equipment compared to their German counterparts. Air power also played a role in these early engagements. Soviet aircraft, primarily Il-2 Sturmovix and Yak fighters, conducted ground attack missions against Axis supply lines and strongpoints. These sorties disrupted movement and inflicted damage on convoys, but were limited by weather conditions, which frequently grounded operations. German and Hungarian air units, including remnants of Luftwaffe fighter groups and the Royal Hungarian Air Force, attempted to contest Soviet dominance, though their numbers were insufficient to gain control. The air war over Târgu Secuiesc became one of attrition, with the Axis relying on concentrated anti-aircraft fire to protect critical nodes rather than seeking large-scale air superiority. By the end of October, the front lines around Târgu Secuiesc had shifted slightly in favor of the Soviet-Romanian forces, but no decisive breakthrough had been achieved. The attackers had captured several outlying villages and ridges, but remained short of their objective of forcing a clear passage through the Axis defensive arc. The defenders had suffered notable losses in manpower and equipment, yet continued to hold strong points that controlled the approaches to the town. Reports from both sides emphasized the intensity of the fighting and the high casualty rates. What became evident was that the battle for this sector would extend into November, demanding reinforcement and adaptation from both coalitions. The initial engagements thus set the tone for the wider battle: slow, costly advances met by determined defense, with civilians caught between shifting front lines. The campaign for Târgu Secuiesc was no longer an abstract struggle of strategy and politics, but a brutal reality of trench warfare, attritional assaults, and local counterattacks. Each side recognized that the coming weeks would test their endurance as much as their tactical skill, with the outcome shaping not only the control of eastern Transylvania, but also the trajectory of operations deeper into Hungary. As November 1944 began, the fighting around Târgu Secuiesc escalated into a prolonged struggle marked by reinforcement, attrition, and mounting casualties. Both sides committed additional formations in an effort to alter the stalemate. For the Soviets and Romanians, the offensive was reinforced with new rifle divisions and artillery regiments brought forward through the mountain passes, while mechanized brigades attempted to regroup despite fuel shortages and difficult road conditions. On the Axis side, German and Hungarian high commands transferred reserve units from central Transylvania and the plains near Cluj, determined to prevent a collapse that would expose the interior of Hungary to Soviet entry. The challenges of terrain and weather grew more pronounced. Heavy rains turned into early snowfalls in the Carpathian foothills, complicating troop movements and supply deliveries. Mud and ice rendered many roads nearly impassable for vehicles. forcing both coalitions to rely heavily on horse-drawn transport and manpower for logistics. Soviet and Romanian supply lines extended back through Moldavia and eastern Romania, and any delay in transport directly affected the pace of offensive operations. German and Hungarian forces, for their part, depended on longer rail lines from Budapest, which were increasingly threatened by Allied air attacks and partisan sabotage in occupied territories. The logistical situation created conditions where neither side could easily amass overwhelming force in one sector, contributing to a drawn-out confrontation. On the battlefield itself, the clashes became more intense. Soviet artillery concentrated unprecedented firepower on suspected Axis positions. Batteries of heavy guns, including 152mm howitzers, unleashed barrages designed to shatter trenches and bunkers before infantry advanced. Romanian artillery units, though less numerous and equipped with older pieces, joined in with persistent fire. The defenders responded with counter-battery fire from German 105mm and 150mm guns, as well as Hungarian batteries positioned on elevated ridges. This exchange of fire devastated the countryside and left villages in ruins. For soldiers on both sides, survival often meant enduring hours of bombardment before engaging in close combat amid shattered terrain. Axis resistance continued to be fierce. German officers coordinated local counterattacks using assault groups armed with machine guns, flamethrowers, and grenades, aimed at retaking positions captured by Soviet infantry. Hungarian troops fought with particular determination in sectors directly tied to national pride, such as ridges controlling access to Transylvanian valleys. The 25th Infantry Division, supported by elements of the Hungarian 2nd Armored Division, carried out counterthrusts against Romanian infantry that had advanced into wooded areas north of the town. These actions, though costly, slowed the Soviet-Romanian momentum and forced repeated assaults on the same positions, prolonging the battle. Civilian suffering intensified as the battle zone widened. Many inhabitants who had remained during the October clashes now faced starvation and exposure as winter set in. Agricultural production had been interrupted by military operations, livestock requisitioned, and homes destroyed. Both Axis and Soviet Romanian forces imposed heavy demands on the local population, requisitioning carts, labor, and supplies. Refugee flows increased as families sought safety deeper into Transylvania or across the mountains, though movement was dangerous due to patrols, shifting front lines, and aerial bombardment. For many, survival depended on hiding in forests or caves until combat moved beyond their villages. The psychological toll on soldiers was equally severe. Reports from Soviet units described exhaustion, frostbite, and declining morale after weeks of continuous combat. Romanian troops, despite fighting for the recovery of Transylvania, struggled with shortages of winter clothing and ammunition. German and Hungarian accounts revealed similar hardships, with rations cut and medical supplies dwindling. Field hospitals on both sides were overwhelmed, treating not only battle wounds, but also cases of illness brought on by exposure and unsanitary conditions. Commanders faced the constant problem of sustaining units under these conditions, while still demanding offensive or defensive action. At the political level, the fighting around Târgu Secuiesc became a symbol of the broader contest between alliances. Romanian leaders emphasized their army's sacrifices to secure Allied recognition of Transylvania's reintegration. The Soviet press portrayed the advance as another step in the liberation of Eastern Europe, while also highlighting the role of Romanian allies as evidence of the success of the August coup. Axis propaganda, conversely, stressed the defense of Hungarian soil against invasion, framing the battles as a national struggle for survival. These narratives were intended to bolster domestic morale, though the reality at the front often contrasted sharply with official rhetoric. Despite the intensity of combat, neither coalition achieved a decisive breakthrough in early November. Soviet and Romanian forces gained ground incrementally, capturing several fortified villages and ridgelines, but the approaches to Târgu Secuiesc itself remained contested. German and Hungarian defenders, though weakened, continued to regroup and mount counterattacks. The battle evolved into a cycle of advance, counterattack, and stalemate. with each side incurring heavy losses for limited territorial gains. Estimates from the period suggest that thousands of soldiers on both sides were killed or wounded during these weeks, reflecting the ferocity of the struggle in a relatively small geographic area. By mid-November, commanders on both sides recognized that the battle had reached a critical point. The Soviets and Romanians prepared to commit fresh reserves and intensify artillery bombardments to force a breakthrough, while the Axis command sought reinforcements from Hungary to sustain its defense. The struggle for Târgu Secuiesc was no longer a series of local engagements, but a major confrontation drawing in significant resources and attention. The coming weeks promised even greater escalation, as both alliances resolved to decide the outcome in the harsh winter landscape of eastern Transylvania. By late November 1944, the battle around Târgu Secuiesc reached its most intense phase. After weeks of inconclusive fighting, Soviet and Romanian commanders resolved to break the Axis defensive arc with a concentrated assault, committing larger reserves and heavy firepower to the sector. The Stavka directed the Second Ukrainian Front to apply maximum pressure, coordinating with Romanian 1st and 4th armies to secure a decisive penetration. Their strategy emphasized overwhelming artillery barrages, followed by mass infantry and mechanized thrusts intended to shatter German and Hungarian cohesion. The objective was clear: open a corridor through the Carpathian foothills into the Transylvanian basin and force the Axis into a general withdrawal. Preparations for this offensive were meticulous. Soviet engineers worked tirelessly to improve roads and bridges, enabling the movement of heavy guns and armored columns through terrain still clogged with mud and early snow. Supply depots were established closer to the front, stocked with ammunition and food to sustain prolonged attacks. Romanian units received reinforcements drawn from divisions newly reorganized after the August coup, though their equipment remained limited. Despite shortages, morale in many Romanian formations remained high, sustained by the political goal of reclaiming Transylvanian territory. The Soviets, experienced in large-scale offensives, ensured that artillery concentrations were among the heaviest yet seen in this theater. On the Axis side, German and Hungarian forces anticipated the impending assault. Intelligence reports, reconnaissance, and prisoner interrogations revealed Soviet preparations. General Otto Wöhler reinforced the sector with elements of German panzer units, including remnants of the 23rd Panzer Division, alongside Hungarian armored detachments. These units were few in number, but provided mobile reserves capable of counterattacking vulnerable spearheads. The Axis defensive plan relied on layered strongpoints, combining minefields, entrenched infantry, and artillery support to absorb initial blows, followed by counterattacks designed to restore broken lines. Hungarian divisions in particular bore the brunt of defending the immediate approaches to Târgu Secuiesc, while German units acted as a stabilizing force wherever Soviet pressure threatened to achieve a breakthrough. The offensive began with a massive artillery preparation in the final days of November. Thousands of shells rained down on Axis positions, targeting trench networks, communication centers, and suspected strongpoints. Entire sections of the front were enveloped in smoke and fire, as Soviet and Romanian gunners maintained bombardments for hours. Civilian settlements caught within the bombardment zone suffered extensive destruction. Churches, schools, and homes collapsed under shell fire, forcing those who had not evacuated to seek shelter in cellars or makeshift bunkers. For the defenders, survival during these barrages depended on hardened shelters and rapid reoccupation of positions once the shelling lifted. Following the bombardment, Soviet rifle divisions advanced in waves, supported by tanks and self-propelled guns. Romanian infantry units followed closely, tasked with consolidating captured ground. Fighting quickly became close quarters as Axis defenders emerged from bunkers and counterattacked with grenades and flamethrowers. German machine gun nests inflicted heavy casualties, and Hungarian artillery, though limited in shells, proved effective against Soviet infantry concentrations. The battlefield transformed into a patchwork of shattered villages and trenches contested repeatedly over the course of days. Gains were measured in hundreds of meters, often reversed by determined counterthrusts. Air power reached its height during this stage. Soviet Il-2 ground attack aircraft and PE-2 bombers struck Axis artillery positions and supply lines, while fighters patrolled to prevent German or Hungarian air units from interfering. The Luftwaffe, operating with reduced numbers, deployed FW-190 and Bf-109 fighters to cover Hungarian ground forces, occasionally achieving local successes but unable to challenge Soviet air superiority. Hungarian air units, including Me-210 and Ju-87 aircraft, carried out limited sorties against Soviet tank columns, but losses mounted quickly in the face of superior numbers. Air battles over the region underscored the growing disparity in resources between the coalitions. Civilian displacement reached its peak. Entire villages around Târgu Secuiesc were abandoned as residents fled westward into central Transylvania or sought refuge in the mountains. Accounts described roads filled with carts, livestock, and families moving in the bitter cold, often targeted inadvertently by artillery or strafing aircraft. Those who remained behind faced requisitioning from both sides. Grain, cattle, and even personal belongings were taken to feed the armies. In some areas, civilians were conscripted into constructing field fortifications or clearing mines, exposing them to direct danger. Hunger and exposure during this period claimed many lives, even away from the battlefield itself. For soldiers, the psychological burden became extreme. Soviet and Romanian troops endured relentless counterattacks that tested endurance as much as courage. German and Hungarian defenders, often isolated and cut off from supply, faced the grim task of holding positions to the last possible moment. Reports from both sides noted instances of units reduced to a fraction of their original strength. Field hospitals overflowed with casualties, lacking sufficient medical supplies to treat frostbite and infection, in addition to battlefield wounds. Commanders on both sides confronted the difficulty of maintaining discipline and morale under such conditions, relying on propaganda and appeals to duty to sustain their men. By early December, the offensive had succeeded in breaching sections of the Axis line, but had not yet achieved a decisive collapse. Soviet and Romanian forces occupied several ridges and villages closer to Târgu Secuiesc, tightening pressure on the defenders. Yet German and Hungarian counterattacks prevented a complete breakthrough, ensuring that the battle continued to drain resources and manpower on both sides. The intensity of fighting during this period marked the peak of the campaign, a moment when the fate of eastern Transylvania hung in balance. The struggle was now a contest of endurance, with winter deepening and neither coalition prepared to concede the field. The prolonged contest for Târgu Secuiesc entered a stage of resistance and adaptation as December 1944 unfolded. After the costly Soviet-Romanian offensives at the end of November, both coalitions reassessed their strategies. For the attackers, the initial hope of a rapid breakthrough had given way to the reality of entrenched Axis defenses and punishing counterattacks. For the defenders, the expectation of holding indefinitely was tempered by the recognition that supply shortages, attrition, and Soviet numerical superiority would eventually force withdrawals. The result was a phase characterized by tactical improvisation, defensive ingenuity, and the psychological strain of extended combat in severe winter conditions. Soviet and Romanian forces adjusted by shifting toward methodical, incremental advances rather than seeking a single decisive rupture. Commanders divided the sector into smaller objectives, individual ridges, villages, or fortified positions that could be isolated and overwhelmed with concentrated artillery before infantry moved in. This approach required extensive coordination between artillery, infantry, and armor, often hindered by the terrain and weather. Romanian units played an important role in holding ground once captured, freeing Soviet divisions to continue the offensive. Engineers adapted by constructing corduroy roads over frozen ground, allowing tanks and supply vehicles to move through areas previously impassable in autumn mud. The Axis defenders likewise demonstrated resilience through adaptation. German officers emphasized elastic defense, yielding ground under pressure, then counterattacking when Soviet-Romanian forces overextended. This tactic conserved manpower while inflicting steady losses. Hungarian divisions, though often understrength, relied on their familiarity with the terrain. They constructed hidden bunkers and forested slopes, laid new minefields, and camouflaged artillery positions. Small assault groups specialized in night raids, harassing Soviet and Romanian positions, cutting communication lines, and capturing prisoners for intelligence. Despite shortages, this flexibility allowed the Axis to prolong resistance beyond what Soviet planners had initially anticipated. Material constraints shaped every decision. Soviet supply columns moved under constant strain, their trucks struggling on icy mountain roads. Ammunition and fuel had to be rationed, slowing the pace of operations. Romanian units frequently reported deficiencies in heavy weaponry and winter equipment, relying on Soviet depots for resupply. On the Axis side, the scarcity was even more acute. Hungarian formations complained of inadequate artillery shells and dwindling food stocks. German reports noted the necessity of rotating divisions out of the lines sooner than planned, as units suffered unsustainable losses in both personnel and equipment. Makeshift repairs kept artillery and armored vehicles operational, but the long-term outlook was grim. Civilian populations adapted in ways that reflected both necessity and coercion. Many communities survived by trading with whichever army occupied their area at a given moment. Farmers concealed livestock or grain to avoid requisitioning, while others bartered supplies with soldiers in exchange for protection. In contested zones, civilians often performed forced labor, building fortifications, clearing snow from supply routes, or carrying ammunition. These tasks exposed them to artillery fire and the dangers of proximity to active combat. Refugee columns moving through the region created additional logistical burdens as armies diverted resources to control or redirect civilian movements. For many families, survival depended on constant mobility, seeking shelter wherever fighting temporarily receded. Psychological endurance became a decisive factor. Soviet and Romanian soldiers, encouraged by political officers, were told their sacrifices secured the liberation of Transylvania and the advance toward Budapest. Propaganda posters and frontline newspapers reinforced this message, though fatigue and casualties eroded enthusiasm. Romanian troops in particular carried a dual burden, proving loyalty to their new allies while facing former comrades in arms across the battlefield. German soldiers, aware of the deteriorating situation across Europe, were urged to hold firm to protect Hungary and buy time for defenses further west. Hungarian troops were motivated by the defense of their homeland, but morale fluctuated as winter deepened and casualties mounted. Letters home reflected both determination and despair, showing the strain on soldiers who understood the precariousness of their situation. Air operations adapted to winter conditions. Soviet ground attack aircraft shifted focus from large-scale bombardment to precision strikes on Axis supply routes and strong points. Night bombing raids disrupted rest and supply for defenders. The Luftwaffe and Royal Hungarian Air Force continued to operate but on a reduced scale, conserving fuel and aircraft for critical missions. Anti-aircraft units on both sides gained prominence, with Soviet heavy guns protecting supply depots and Axis batteries defending fortified villages. Air superiority remained with the Soviets, but the deteriorating weather limited the scale of aerial involvement. By mid-December, the battle lines around Târgu Secuiesc had changed only incrementally. Soviet and Romanian forces had advanced further into the defensive arc, seizing several key ridges and cutting Axis supply routes, but the town itself remained contested. German and Hungarian counterattacks slowed every advance, preventing the attackers from achieving operational freedom of maneuver. The front resembled a war of exhaustion. Both sides suffered heavy casualties, and every tactical adaptation was met by a countermeasure. The cumulative effect was to drain the strength of Axis forces while forcing Soviet and Romanian commanders to expend more resources than anticipated. The adaptation phase thus revealed the determination of all participants. Soldiers fought not only with weapons but with ingenuity, finding ways to endure cold, hunger, and fatigue while maintaining their positions. Civilians developed strategies for survival under constant disruption. Commanders on both sides experimented with tactics suited to a battle of attrition in difficult terrain. Yet, beneath this resilience, the balance of power continued to shift, for the Axis could not replenish its losses at the same rate as the Soviets and Romanians. the stage was set for a turning point, when accumulated strain would finally break the defenders' ability to hold the line around Târgu Secuiesc. The turning point in the battle for Târgu Secuiesc arrived in the final weeks of December 1944, when the cumulative weight of Soviet and Romanian pressure finally overcame the Axis defensive system. After weeks of incremental advances and attritional fighting, Soviet commanders concentrated their resources for one decisive blow. Reinforcements from the 7th Guards Army were deployed to the sector, supported by fresh artillery brigades and armored units that had been redirected from quieter stretches of the front. The Romanian 1st and 4th Armies also reinforced their contingents, with new divisions committed despite severe shortages of equipment. Their combined strength now outnumbered the Axis defenders by a significant margin, estimated at nearly 2-to-1 in infantry and 3-to-1 in artillery pieces. The Axis High Command, aware of the growing imbalance, struggled to maintain coherence. German units, particularly remnants of the 23rd Panzer Division and several infantry regiments of the 8th Army, were redeployed to shore up critical sectors, while Hungarian divisions, including the 9th Infantry and 2nd Armored, attempted to hold the immediate approaches to Târgu Secuiesc. Yet these formations were exhausted, undersupplied, and often reduced to a fraction of their original strength. Ammunition rationing forced artillery batteries to fire only in response to major assaults, and fuel shortages restricted armored counterattacks. Hungarian commanders pleaded for reinforcements, but with the Eastern Front collapsing on multiple fronts, German resources could no longer meet every demand. The decisive offensive began with one of the heaviest bombardments of the campaign. On 20th of December, Soviet and Romanian artillery unleashed a sustained barrage across a 20-kilometer sector of the front. Thousands of shells struck trenches, dugouts, and communication lines, shattering Axis strongpoints and disrupting command networks. The bombardment was followed by coordinated airstrikes, with Soviet Il-2 aircraft targeting artillery positions and transport routes. Civilian settlements in the bombardment zone were devastated, their remaining inhabitants forced into makeshift shelters or caught in the destruction. Survivors later recalled the landscape as a wasteland of smoke, fire, and collapsed buildings. Infantry assaults followed immediately. Soviet Guards divisions spearheaded the attack, advancing through shattered defenses with tank support. Romanian units moved in tandem, tasked with consolidating captured ground and pushing into secondary positions. Resistance remained fierce as German and Hungarian troops fought from bunkers and forested slopes. Local counterattacks, often led by small groups of panzer grenadiers with machine guns and panzerfausts, inflicted heavy casualties. But, unlike in earlier weeks, the Axis defenders lacked the reserves to retake lost positions once overrun. Each successive Soviet assault pushed deeper, steadily unraveling the defensive arc. One of the critical moments occurred near the high ground northwest of the town, where Hungarian infantry attempted to hold a ridgeline overlooking the main road. Soviet artillery pounded the positions relentlessly, and Romanian infantry stormed the slopes after repeated barrages. Despite determined defense, the ridge fell after 2 days of fighting, opening a gap through which Soviet mechanized forces advanced. This breach allowed tanks and motorized infantry to bypass several fortified villages, forcing Axis troops to withdraw or risk encirclement. The fall of this position marked the beginning of the collapse of the Axis line around Târgu Secuiesc. Civilian populations witnessed the shift firsthand. Refugee columns multiplied as Axis troops retreated, often requisitioning carts and horses to move equipment. Families fled westward in the freezing cold, while others were caught between retreating Axis units and advancing Soviet-Romanian forces. Looting and requisitioning intensified during these chaotic days, as both sides struggled to sustain their men. Reports from local administrators described towns stripped of resources, with civilians left to endure winter without food or fuel. For many, the turning point in the battle meant displacement, loss of property, and the uncertainty of life under new control. Morale diverged sharply between the combatants. Soviet and Romanian soldiers, though exhausted by weeks of fighting, sensed that victory was near. Political officers emphasized the symbolic value of breaching the defenses of Transylvania, portraying it as proof of the irreversible decline of Axis resistance in the region. Romanian troops in particular took pride in reclaiming villages they regarded as part of their national territory, even as casualties mounted. On the Axis side, despair became widespread. German officers reported increasing desertion among Hungarian units, while Hungarian commanders noted declining discipline and the difficulty of maintaining cohesion under constant bombardment. Although some units fought to the last, others withdrew in disarray, accelerating the collapse. By Christmas 1944, Soviet and Romanian forces had entered Târgu Secuiesc itself. The town, already badly damaged by artillery and airstrikes, offered little organized resistance. Remaining Axis troops retreated westward towards Sfântu Gheorghe and the interior of Transylvania, leaving behind prisoners, equipment, and wounded. The capture of the town marked the effective end of the Axis defensive campaign in this sector. Although sporadic resistance continued in surrounding hills, the organized line that had held for months was decisively broken. The consequences of this breakthrough were immediate. The fall of Târgu Secuiesc opened a corridor through which Soviet and Romanian forces could advance toward central Transylvania and, ultimately, the Hungarian plain. German and Hungarian forces, already strained, now faced the prospect of further retreats under constant pressure. For the civilians of the region, the turning point brought an end to one phase of occupation, but introduced the uncertainties of another, as Soviet and Romanian administrations replaced Hungarian control. The battle had transformed the landscape and shattered communities, leaving a legacy of destruction even as it shifted the strategic balance of the war. The aftermath of the December breakthrough around Târgu Secuiesc unfolded rapidly in early January 1945. Once the Soviet and Romanian armies had forced the collapse of Axis defenses, German and Hungarian commanders ordered a general withdrawal towards central Transylvania. The retreat, though organized in some areas, often became chaotic under relentless pursuit. Soviet mechanized units pressed hard, exploiting gaps in the retreating lines, while Romanian infantry secured captured ground and attempted to prevent counter-infiltration. The once formidable Axis defensive belt that had anchored on Târgu Secuiesc ceased to exist, replaced by scattered rearguard actions and shattered formations attempting to regroup further west. The withdrawal was marked by heavy losses. German reports acknowledged that several divisions, including the remnants of the 76th Infantry and elements of the 23rd Panzer Division, had been reduced to combat groups with only a fraction of their original manpower. Hungarian formations fared no better. The 2nd Armored Division had lost most of its vehicles, while infantry units such as the 9th and 25th Divisions were depleted to the point of near dissolution. Many Axis soldiers were captured during encirclements in villages and valleys as Soviet forces pressed forward. Prisoners included both Germans and Hungarians, along with abandoned equipment and artillery that could no longer be moved due to fuel shortages. These captures provided the Soviets and Romanians with both tactical advantage and valuable propaganda material. The humanitarian consequences were severe. Civilian populations, already weakened by months of combat, now faced the devastation of retreat and occupation. Villages abandoned by Axis forces were often left in ruins, stripped of resources or burned to deny shelter to the advancing enemy. Refugee columns clogged roads, mixing civilians with retreating soldiers. Families sought safety in central Transylvania, or even across the border into Hungary. But transport was scarce, and winter conditions made the journeys perilous. Disease and starvation spread in camps and improvised shelters. For many civilians, the retreat of Axis forces did not bring relief, but new hardships as they were caught between moving fronts and the administrative transition to Soviet-Romanian control. In the military sphere, the Soviet and Romanian command structures focused on consolidating their gains. Romanian units, after securing the town and surrounding villages, were tasked with clearing remaining Axis pockets of resistance in the hills. These operations were often small-scale but intense, involving close combat against German or Hungarian rearguard detachments determined to cover the withdrawal of their main forces. Soviet units pressed westward, seeking to maintain momentum and prevent the Axis from establishing a new defensive line further inside Transylvania. The strategic direction now aimed beyond the Carpathians into Hungary itself, with Târgu Secuiesc representing a stepping stone in the wider campaign. For Romania, the capture of Târgu Secuiesc and the expulsion of Axis forces from this region had immediate political consequences. The government in Bucharest highlighted the victory as evidence of Romania's commitment to the Allied cause and as justification for its claim to northern Transylvania. Romanian military communiques emphasized the role of national divisions in the offensive, stressing their sacrifices and contribution alongside Soviet formations. This narrative was important not only for domestic morale, but also for negotiations with the Allies regarding Romania's post-war borders. The restoration of Transylvanian territory remained a central objective of Romanian diplomacy as the war entered its final months. For Hungary, the defeat carried grave implications. The loss of Târgu Secuiesc and eastern Transylvania accelerated the retreat of Hungarian forces toward their homeland. Politically, the collapse undermined the legitimacy of the Hungarian government, which had already been destabilized by internal divisions and German influence. The strategic value of Transylvania as a buffer zone had evaporated, leaving the Hungarian plain increasingly exposed to Soviet advance. This reality set the stage for the defense of Budapest, which would soon become the next major focal point of the Eastern Front. The immediate military consequences were equally significant for the German High Command. The failure to hold the Transylvanian line further strained already depleted reserves and limited the Wehrmacht's capacity to resist on other fronts. Army Group South Ukraine, already weakened by previous defeats, was forced into a general contraction of its front lines. German strategic communications conceded that the loss of Transylvania created vulnerabilities stretching from the Carpathians to the Danube. Commanders attempted to stabilize the situation with rearguard actions, but the larger momentum of Soviet advances proved unstoppable. The civilian administration of recaptured areas presented challenges for the Soviets and Romanians. Establishing control required rebuilding basic infrastructure, restoring transport links, and securing supply routes. Local populations, divided by ethnic and political loyalties, faced scrutiny. Ethnic Hungarians feared reprisals or loss of property under Romanian administration, while ethnic Romanians welcomed the return of Romanian authority, but also feared Soviet requisitioning and control. The transitional period was marked by uncertainty, with military rule often replacing civilian governance until stability could be restored. By the end of January 1945, the battles of Târgu Secuiesc had concluded. The Axis had withdrawn, leaving the town and surrounding areas under Soviet-Romanian occupation. The fighting had lasted for months, transforming landscapes and communities. What remained were destroyed villages, depopulated areas, and tens of thousands of casualties on both sides. The struggle, though local in geography, had implications that extended far beyond the region. It secured a strategic gateway into Hungary, contributed to the realignment of Romania within the Allied camp, and underscored the inability of the Axis to maintain its defensive perimeter in Eastern Europe. The final phase of the war in the region was now set to unfold west of the Carpathians, but the memory of the bloody battles for Târgu Secuiesc lingered among soldiers and civilians alike as a testament to the ferocity of late-war combat. The legacy of the battles for Târgu Secuiesc extended far beyond the winter of 1944-45. Though in purely geographical terms, the engagement concerned a relatively small sector of eastern Transylvania, its consequences rippled through the broader history of the region, the war in Central Europe, and the post-war order. The clash illustrated the brutal nature of late-war combat, where industrial-scale offensives and coalition warfare collided with exhausted armies, devastated civilian communities, and unresolved national disputes. In military terms, the struggle demonstrated both the resilience and the limitations of the Axis coalition in its final months. German units, though still capable of disciplined resistance and effective counterattacks, were undermined by dwindling resources, overstretched supply lines, and a strategic environment in which losses could no longer be replaced. Hungarian divisions, fighting on soil that their government regarded as vital national territory, displayed determination but faced insurmountable shortages of equipment, training, and external support. Their inability to hold Târgu Secuiesc underlined the broader weakening of Hungary's military capacity just as the Red Army pressed toward Budapest. The loss of this region was one more step in the gradual erosion of Axis positions across Eastern Europe. For the Soviet Union, the campaign confirmed the effectiveness of its operational methods developed since 1943: massed artillery barrages, combined arms assaults, and the integration of Allied forces under its command structure. Though progress had been slower and more costly than anticipated, the eventual breakthrough proved that the Red Army could sustain offensive momentum even in difficult mountain terrain and harsh winter conditions. The capture of Târgu Secuiesc opened corridors into central Transylvania and contributed to the subsequent encirclement of Budapest, which would become one of the decisive sieges of the war. In the larger framework of Soviet strategy, the campaign was a stepping stone in the final drive toward Vienna and the heart of Central Europe. For Romania, the battle held immense political and symbolic weight. Having shifted sides in August 1944, the Romanian government sought to prove its loyalty to the Allied cause not only through declarations, but through concrete military contributions. The participation of Romanian armies in the bloody fighting for Târgu Secuiesc offered tangible evidence of this commitment. Romanian leaders used the victory to strengthen their claims to the restoration of Transylvania, which was confirmed in principle by the Allies at war's end. Yet this success came at a steep cost. Romanian divisions sustained tens of thousands of casualties in the campaign, straining a country already exhausted by years of war. The sacrifice became part of Romania's national narrative of redemption, though one overshadowed by the reality of Soviet domination in the post-war years. For Hungary, the defeat at Târgu Secuiesc symbolized the beginning of the end. The territorial gains of 1940 were reversed, and the defensive buffer provided by Transylvania was lost. Politically, the battles highlighted the vulnerability of the Hungarian state, caught between German dependency and the inevitability of Soviet conquest. The losses sustained by Hungarian divisions further weakened the country's capacity to defend Budapest, hastening the encirclement and siege of the capital. After the war, Hungary would face not only military defeat, but also political transformation, with its wartime alliances used as justification for post-war occupation and restructuring. The civilian experience of the battle left scars that endured long after the armies moved on. Villages around Târgu Secuiesc were reduced to rubble, their populations displaced or decimated by the crossfire of artillery and aerial bombardment. Families that had endured multiple changes of administration, Romanian, Hungarian, German, and Soviet, struggled with shifting loyalties, confiscations, and reprisals. Ethnic tensions, long manipulated by political authorities, were exacerbated by wartime suffering. For many communities, the destruction of homes, farms, and infrastructure created conditions of hardship that persisted into the late 1940s. Reconstruction was slow, and memories of forced labor, requisition, and displacement shaped local identities for decades. Historically, the battles also became part of larger debates over wartime memory and territorial claims. In Romania, the campaign was commemorated as part of the liberation of Transylvania, a narrative emphasizing unity and sacrifice. In Hungary, it was remembered as part of a tragic national struggle, highlighting endurance against overwhelming odds. Soviet accounts, meanwhile, integrated the battle into their broader story of the Red Army's march toward victory in Europe. Each perspective framed the events differently, reflecting political priorities rather than shared memory. These competing narratives complicated reconciliation in the region, ensuring that the meaning of the battle remained contested well after the war. The long-term significance of the fighting lies in its illustration of how local battles shaped continental outcomes. The collapse of Axis defenses in eastern Transylvania facilitated the Soviet advance into Central Europe, accelerating the fall of Budapest and the eventual liberation of Vienna. Politically, the campaign reinforced Romania's reorientation toward the Allies, even as it placed the country firmly within the Soviet sphere of influence. For Hungary, the loss of Transylvania and the subsequent battles on its own soil marked the final unraveling of wartime ambitions and the beginning of a new geopolitical reality. The legacy of Târgu Secuiesc, then, is not measured solely in kilometers gained or divisions lost, but in the broader transformations it symbolized. It marked the end of Axis hopes of stabilizing the front in Eastern Europe, the confirmation of Romania's return to the Allied camp, and the deepening of Soviet influence across the region. For the civilians who endured the fighting, it left a landscape of destruction and memories of suffering that endured for generations. In the annals of World War II, the bloody battles for Târgu Secuiesc stand as a reminder of how the global conflict reached even the smaller towns and valleys of Eastern Europe, reshaping their destinies within the larger drama of a continent at war.